History is often taught as a sequence of explosions, revolutions, invasions, collapses. The end of empires is usually framed as sudden and dramatic. But in reality, most empires do not fall in a moment. They fade quietly, systematically. The Dutch Republic did not collapse. It aged. In the 17th century, the Netherlands was the wealthiest place on earth. Amsterdam was the financial center of the world. Dutch ships dominated global trade. Dutch workshops produced goods for every major market. Capital, manufacturing, logistics, and finance were integrated into a single, efficient system. It was an empire built not on conquest, but on production. For a long time, that system worked. The Dutch economy was grounded in making things, moving things, and selling things. Wealth came from activity, from output, from real economic work. Finance existed to support trade, not replace it. The engine was productive, and the financial system was subordinate to it. Then the balance shifted. As the Dutch became richer, production became less attractive, returns from trade narrowed, competition increased, wages rose, manufacturing slowly moved elsewhere, not by decree, not by collapse, by incentives. Capital followed easier returns. Speculation became more appealing than production. Lending became more profitable than making. This is where the pattern begins. The economy did not shrink. It financialized. Instead of building ships, Dutch elites financed them. Instead of running workshops, they funded them. Instead of producing goods, they owned the paper that controlled them. Wealth did not disappear. It changed form. The center of gravity moved from industry to finance. At first, this looked like progress. Higher margins, lower labor risk, cleaner balance sheets. But something structural was happening. The productive base was thinning. Once manufacturing leaves, it rarely returns. Skills disappear. Supply chains dissolve. Local resilience weakens. The economy becomes dependent on external production and internal finance. It still looks wealthy, but it is no longer self-sustaining. The Dutch Republic was becoming rich without becoming strong. This is the crucial distinction. An economy built on production generates resilience. An economy built on finance generates liquidity. Liquidity moves. Resilience does not. As manufacturing declined, Dutch elites did not fight to restore it. They adapted. They invested abroad. They diversified. They exited. Capital left quietly, not as flight, but as strategy. Wealth preserved itself even as the domestic engine slowed. This is not betrayal. It is rational behavior inside a changing system, and it is repeatable. If you value this kind of historical clarity, consider liking the video, sharing your perspective, and subscribing for future episodes. The Republic did not experience mass panic. There was no single crisis, no obvious breaking point. Trade continued, finance flourished, the system remained orderly. But the foundations were no longer aligned with the surface. The empire was still visible, the engine was not. This is what makes decline hard to recognize. It does not feel like collapse. It feels like evolution, efficiency, maturity. But maturity without regeneration becomes stagnation. The Dutch did not lose their empire because they were conquered. They lost it because they outgrew the system that made them powerful. And once an economy crosses that line, from production to speculation, from industry to paper, from building to owning, the trajectory becomes difficult to reverse. Not because of policy, because of structure. This is the beginning of the Dutch pattern, and it is not unique. The shift from production to finance does not announce itself as decline. It announces itself as sophistication. For the Dutch Republic, financialization looked like progress. Capital became more efficient. Risk was diversified. Returns were smoother. The economy appeared stable, even elegant. Amsterdam remained wealthy. The balance sheets still looked strong. But stability and strength are not the same thing. As manufacturing moved outward, dependence moved inward. The Republic became reliant on foreign production and domestic finance. It no longer controlled the full chain of value. It controlled the paper that referenced it. This is a subtle but critical transition. An economy that produces controls outcomes. An economy that finances depends on them. This is where vulnerability begins. The Dutch did not lose their skills overnight. They lost their incentives. Investment flowed to easier returns. Foreign ventures, colonial debt, overseas assets. Capital left, not because the nation was failing, but because other systems were rising faster. The world was changing, and Dutch wealth moved with it. This is the second phase of the pattern. The elite exit, not as panic, as optimization. Wealth seeks protection. It seeks liquidity. It seeks jurisdictions, structures, and instruments that reduce exposure to domestic decline. This is not disloyalty. It is system behavior. When returns weaken at home, capital migrates. Always has, always will. The result is a quiet hollowing. The surface remains intact. Institutions still function. The currency still trades. The city still shines. But the economic center of gravity has shifted elsewhere. The engine is no longer under national control. This is not collapse. It is detachment. And detachment has consequences. Once capital leaves, it takes optionality with it. Innovation slows, investment narrows. The domestic economy becomes service-oriented, consumption-driven, and increasingly dependent on financial flows rather than productive output. The system begins to recycle wealth instead of generating it. This is the third phase. The state adapts. When production weakens, revenue must be maintained, taxes rise, borrowing increases. Financial engineering replaces industrial growth. The system becomes more complex, not more productive. Policy focuses on managing decline rather than reversing it. This is not incompetence. It is constraint. The Dutch Republic did not mismanage itself into irrelevance. It evolved into a form that could no longer regenerate power. The institutions remained. The competence remained. The capital remained. But the capacity to project economic force diminished. This is how empires end in modernity. Not with invasion, with irrelevance. And this is where the parallel becomes uncomfortable. Because the pattern is not cultural, it is structural. Any system that transitions from production to speculation, from building to owning, from making to managing, enters the same trajectory. The timeline may differ. The surface may look different. But the mechanics are consistent. The Dutch were not uniquely flawed. They were simply early. They were the first to become truly financialized. And they were the first to discover what happens when finance becomes the economy rather than serving it. This is not a moral failure. It is a systemic one. And systems do not respond to intention. They respond to incentives. Once the incentives shift, the outcome is predictable. The Republic did not fall. It was bypassed. Global trade routes reorganized. Power moved to systems that still produced, still built, still controlled the full chain. The Dutch remained wealthy, but they were no longer central. This is the quiet ending, not defeat, displacement. And displacement is harder to reverse than collapse because it does not feel urgent until it is complete. By the time the Dutch Republic understood what it had become, the pattern was already complete. Production had moved, capital had exited, trade routes had reorganized. The empire still existed in form, but not in function. Wealth remained, but power had thinned. The system had not failed. It had matured past its capacity to regenerate itself. This is the final phase. The economy becomes extractive rather than generative. When production leaves, value is no longer created locally. It is imported, financed, or captured. Growth depends on asset appreciation, financial leverage, and external demand. The system survives by circulation, not creation. It moves money rather than making it. This works, for a time. But it produces a specific kind of fragility. Without a productive base, shocks cannot be absorbed. Disruptions cannot be corrected internally. The system loses elasticity. It becomes dependent on global conditions it does not control. When those conditions shift, there is no buffer. This is why financialized empires end quietly. There is no decisive battle, no dramatic collapse. There is simply a steady reduction in relevance. Decisions are made elsewhere. Innovation happens elsewhere. Power accumulates elsewhere. The Dutch Republic did not disappear. It became peripheral. And that is the real ending. Because modern power is not about survival. It is about centrality. Once an economy is no longer central to production, trade, or innovation, it can remain wealthy and still be strategically irrelevant. Influence does not vanish. It relocates. This is the part history rarely emphasizes. The Dutch did not lose their empire through incompetence or decadence. They lost it through structural transition. They moved from building to owning, from producing to financing, from generating power to preserving wealth. That shift protected elites. It did not protect the system. This is the great exit, not an event, a process. Capital leaves first, skills follow, institutions adapt, the population adjusts. What remains is a society that consumes more than it creates and manages more than it builds. It feels advanced, it feels stable, it feels complete. But it is no longer ascending. This is where the parallel becomes visible, because the pattern does not belong to the Dutch. It belongs to financialized empires. Any system that prioritizes asset ownership over production, speculation over manufacturing, and liquidity over resilience enters the same trajectory. The names change, the scale changes, the language modernizes, the mechanics do not. This is not a prediction. It is a pattern. Empires do not fall when they are poor. They fall when they are rich and no longer need to produce. The Dutch were the first modern economy to complete this cycle. That is why their story feels unfamiliar. There were no ruins, no final siege, no catastrophe, just a gradual relocation of power. History recorded the wars. It missed the exit. And that is why this pattern is so dangerous, because it does not look like decline. It looks like success, rising markets, strong currency, global assets, financial sophistication. These are the visible signs. But beneath them, the productive base is thinning. The domestic engine is weakening. The system is becoming dependent on structures it does not control. Once that happens, recovery becomes difficult. Not because of policy, but because of time. You cannot quickly rebuild skills that have disappeared. You cannot instantly restore supply chains that have dissolved. You cannot easily reverse incentives that have been in place for generations. The Dutch could not. Not because they failed, because they evolved. And evolution does not go backward. The uncomfortable truth is that empires rarely collapse from external pressure alone. They reconfigure themselves internally until power no longer resides where the structure still exists. That is the Dutch pattern. Quiet, orderly, inevitable, and it has happened before.